from George Ivanovich Gurdjieff's All and Everything. Chapter 30. Art. Reading 3. And as regards this word art itself, upon which, thanks to the strangeness of their reason, there has been piled up during this time, as they themselves would say, devil knows what. I must tell you that my special investigations regarding this word made it clear to me that when this word, among the other words and separate expressions used by the learned beings of that time, also began automatically to pass from generation to generation, and chanced to get into the vocabulary of certain three-brained beings there, in whose presences, owing to various surrounding circumstances, the crystallizations of the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer proceeded in that sequence and reciprocal action, as a result of which they predisposed the arising in their common presences of data for the being of Hasnamus individuals. Then this said word, for some reason or other, happening to please just this kind of three-brained being there, they began using it for their egoistic aims, and gradually made from it that very something which, although it continues to consist of, as it is said, complete vacuity, yet has gradually collected about itself a fairy-like exterior, which now blinds every one of these favorites of yours who keeps his attention on it only a little longer than usual. Besides this word art, from among the number of other definite words used in their discussions by the learned beings there in Babylon, who were members of the Club of the Adherents of Legal Monism, there also passed automatically from generation to generation quite a number of other words, and even several what are called foggy notions, concerning certain definite understandings of that time. Among the latter, both in respect of name and caricature imitations, are there contemporary theaters now existing there. You may remember I have already told you that both the hall and the demonstrations themselves of the learned beings belonging to the group of mysterists, then at Babylon, were designated by the word theater. If I now explain to you a little more in detail concerning this contemporary theater of theirs, then perhaps you will have enough material for the elucidation, first of all concerning what came of all the good intentions and efforts of the learned beings of the Babylonian period, and secondly, what had passed from all that had already been attained in respect of true knowledge, from the times of that Babylonian culture to the beings of this contemporary European culture, in which the said art has become mainly covered with the mentioned fairy-like exterior. And thirdly, you will sense certain aspects of the maleficence of that contemporary, famous art of theirs. A certain amount of information concerning the activity of the group of the mysterists, the learned members of the Club of the Adherents of Legal Monism, also reached, as I have just told you, the beings of the contemporary epoch, who, wishing to imitate them also in this, began building for this purpose special halls, which they also called theaters. The three-brained beings of the contemporary civilization quite frequently assemble in considerable numbers in these theaters of theirs in order to observe and presumably to study the various prepared manifestations of their actors, as they have quite recently begun to call them, just as the other learned members of the Club of the Adherents of Legal Monism studied then in Babylon the reproductions of the learned beings of the group of the mysterists. These theaters of theirs came to have a significance of the greatest importance in the ordinary process of existence of your favorites, and on account of this they built particularly large buildings for this purpose, which rank in most of their contemporary cities as the most remarkable constructions. It will do no harm, I think, to comment here upon the misunderstanding connected with the word artist. I am bound to comment upon this because this word was also transmitted to your contemporary favorites from the Babylonian epoch, but it was transmitted not like other words, that is, merely as empty words without sense, but just as one single particle of the consonants of a word then used. You must know that the learned beings then in Babylon, the members of the club of the adherents of legomonism, were called by the other learned beings of that time, who were well disposed towards them, as they also called themselves, by the name which your contemporary favorites would write as Orpheist. This word is composed from two definite roots of words then in use, which in contemporary times would signify right and essence. If someone was called thus, it meant that he rightly sensed the essence. After the Babylonian period, this expression also automatically passed from generation to generation with almost the same meaning, but nearly 2 centuries ago, when the beings of that time began wiseacring with the mentioned data, particularly in connection with that empty word, art, and when various what are called schools of art arose and everybody considered himself a follower of one or another of those schools, well, just then, never having understood its genuine sense, and chiefly because among the number of the said schools of art there was also a school of a certain, as the contemporary beings already called him, Orpheus, a figure invented by the ancient Greeks, they then decided to invent a new word defining their vocation more exactly. So instead of the said expression Orpheist, they just invented the word artist, which had to mean he who is occupied with art. In order better to represent to yourself all the causes subsequently arising also from that misunderstanding there, you must first of all know that before the second terrestrial Transapollonian catastrophe, when these favorites of yours still arose and prepared themselves normally for responsible existence, they, by means of intentionally producing from themselves corresponding consonants for their what is called speech, that is, for mutual intercourse, had and could pronounce, also like all the three-brained beings of all the great universe, consonants up to 351 definite what are called letters. But later on, when thanks as always to the same conditions of ordinary being existence abnormally established by themselves, every kind of property proper to the presences of three-brained beings gradually deteriorated, this being ableness also deteriorated in them, and at such a tempo that, whereas the beings of the Babylonian period could use for conversation among themselves only 77 definite consonants, the deterioration continued at such a tempo after the Babylonian period that 5 centuries later the beings there could use at most only 36 definite letters, and the beings of certain communities could not reproduce even this number of separate articulate sounds. So, my boy, as the information concerning the Babylonian period passed from generation to generation to the succeeding generations, not only by means of what is called verbal transmission, but still also by means of marks on durable materials, that is, as it would be expressed there, by means of inscriptions, consisting of conventional signs, which then stood for definite being articulate sounds, or letters. Then, when at the beginning of the contemporary civilization certain beings there began to decipher them from a bit here and a bit there, and realized that they could not sound or pronounce many of these definite letters, they then invented what is called a written compromise. This mentioned written compromise was that instead of the signs or letters which they could not pronounce, although they understood the sense of this pronunciation, they decided to employ a slightly similar letter of their alphabet at the time, and in order that everybody should understand that it was not that letter but quite another, they always wrote by its side a letter of the ancient Romans, now existing but already meaningless, called in English H, and among the contemporary French, H. From then on, all the other of your favorites began doing the same. They added to each of these suspicious letters this Roman inheritance. When this written compromise was invented, they had about 25 of these suspicious letters, but in the course of time, as their ableness to pronounce deteriorated with the increase of their wiseacring, the number of the letters they specially invented for such a being ableness diminished, and by the time the word artist was invented, they had already only 8 of these letters, and in front of this notorious H, they wrote letters, partly ancient Greek and partly ancient Latin, which they indicated in the following way: TH, PH, GH, CH, SCH, KH, DH, and OH. The basis they had for the arising of such a misunderstanding there was the compromising sign PH. And it was the basis because it appeared in the word by which the learned mistress were designated, and also in the word which stood for a personality invented by the ancient Greeks, with whose name, as I have already said, one of the schools of art then existing had been connected. And the result of this was that the mentioned representatives of this terrestrial art of that time, with their already now quite bobtailed reason, thought that it was nothing more than the word indicating the followers of this historical personality, Orpheus. And as many of them did not regard themselves as his followers, then instead of the mentioned word, they just invented the word artist. As we have seen, not every inheritance of the ancient Romans turned out to be maleficent for the beings of the subsequent generations, but in the given case, this little letter H of theirs has been even an inspiring factor for engendering that being ableness in the presences of such beings of subsequent generations to whom it became already definitely proper to have no initiative or ableness of their own, and they wished and succeeded in substituting for the already long existing definite expression Orpheist the new word artist. Here it is important to inform you concerning a great strangeness there in respect of the mentioned gradual atrophy in the presences of the 3-brained beings of this planet of such a being ableness as the capacity to reproduce the consonants required for verbal intercourse. The point is that the tempo of the deterioration of this being capacity does not proceed in the common presences of beings in the psychic and organic functioning of their planetary bodies in everyone, in every generation uniformly, but it alternates, as it were, at different times and on different parts of the surface of this planet, affecting at one time more the psychic and at another time the organic part of the functioning of the planetary body. A very good elucidating example of what I have just said is afforded by the sensations of the taste and the capacity to pronounce those 2 definite consonants or those letters known there at the present time and used among almost all the contemporary beings who breed on all parts of the surface of your planet, and which passed to them through the ancient Greeks from times long past. The said 2 letters were called by the ancient Greeks theta and delta. Here it is interesting to notice that your favorites of very ancient times specially used just these 2 letters for giving distinct names to 2 quite opposite meanings. Namely, they used the letter theta in words which expressed ideas relating to the notion of good, and the second letter delta they used in words relating to the notion of evil, as for example, theos, that is God, and daimonion, that is demon. The notion and taste of the consonants of both these letters passed to all the beings of the contemporary civilization, but both these different letters having entirely different essences, they for some reason or other indicated by means of one and the same sign, namely the sign TH. For instance, the beings of the contemporary community called Russia however hard they try, cannot pronounce these said 2 letters at all. Yet, nevertheless, they very definitely sense their difference, and whenever they have to use these letters in words with definite notions, then, although the letters they pronounce do not correspond at all, yet they correctly sense their difference, and do not use one letter for the other. On the other hand, the beings of the contemporary community called England still pronounce each separate letter almost as the ancient Greeks pronounced it, but while doing so sense no difference in them, and without the least embarrassment employ, for words of entirely opposite meanings, one and the same conventional sign in the form of their famous th. For instance, when beings of the contemporary England utter their favorite and frequently used expression, thank you can clearly hear the ancient letter theta. And when they pronounce the word they like no less, and also frequently use the word there, you hear quite distinctly and definitely the ancient letter delta. But, all the same, for both these letters they use without any what is called remorse, the same universally paradoxical th. However, I think I've talked enough about terrestrial philology. We had better continue to clear up first the causes why it has been customary among your contemporary favorites to have such theaters everywhere, and afterwards what their contemporary actors do in these theaters and how they manifest themselves there. As regards the question why it became the custom among them to assemble, often in considerable groups, in these theaters of theirs, it was in my opinion because these contemporary theaters of theirs and all that goes on in them happen to correspond very well to the abnormally formed common presences of most of these contemporary 3-brained beings, in whom there had been already finally lost the need, proper to 3-brained beings, to actualize their own initiative in everything, and who exist only according to chance shocks from outside or to the promptings of the consequences crystallized in them of one or other of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer. From the very beginning of the arising of those theaters of theirs, they assembled and now assemble in them for the purpose of watching and studying the reproductions of their contemporary actors. No, they assemble only for the satisfaction of one of the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, a consequence which had been readily crystallized in the common presences of the majority of them and called Urnell, which the contemporary beings now call swaggering. You must know that thanks to the mentioned consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, most of the contemporary beings acquire in their presence a very strange need to evoke the expression in others of the being impulse called astonishment regarding themselves, or even simply to notice it on the faces of those around. The strangeness of this need of theirs is that they get satisfaction from the manifestation of astonishment on the part of others regarding their appearance, which exactly conforms with the demands of what are called fashions, that is to say, with just that maleficent custom of theirs, which began there since the Ticleametian civilization, and which has now become one of those being factors which automatically gives them neither the time nor the possibility to see or sense reality. The maleficent custom for them is that they periodically change the external form of what is called the covering of their nullity. Here, by the way, it is interesting to note that it has gradually become the rule in the general process of the ordinary existence of these 3-brained beings who have taken your fancy that the changes of the appearance of the mentioned covering are governed by such beings there of both sexes as have already become worthy to become candidates for Hasnamus individuals. In this respect, the contemporary theaters turned out to be corresponding for your favorites because it is very convenient and easy for them to show off, as they like to say, their chic coiffures, or the specially tied knot of their cravat, or the daringly bared, what is called Coupeterian part of their body, and so on and so forth, while at the same time they can look at the new manifestations of the fashions already actualized according to the up-to-date indications of those same candidates for Hasnamus individuals. To get a clear picture of what these contemporary actors do during their swaggerings in these theaters, you must first be told about yet another exceedingly strange illness existing there, under the name of Dramatisering, the predisposition to which illness arises in the presences of certain of them, thanks only to the carelessness of what are called their midwives. This criminal carelessness on the part of their midwives is that in most instances, before doing her job, she calls on the way at the houses of her other clients and drinks there rather more than usual of the wine offered her, so that while she is doing her job, she unconsciously makes exclamations, fixed in the process of the ordinary existence of your favorites, like the exorcism of what are called their magicians. And at the moment of, as they say, its appearance in God's world, the new unfortunate being first imbibes the words of this maleficent exorcism. And this exorcism consists of the following words: you, what a mess you've made. Well, my boy, thanks to that criminal carelessness on the part of the midwife, the unfortunate newly appeared being acquires in his presence just that predisposition to the mentioned strange illness. If such a three-brained being there, who has acquired at his first appearance the said predisposition to the illness of Dramatisering, should by the time he reaches the age of a responsible being know how to write and should wish to write something, then he suddenly gets this strange illness and begins wiseacring on paper, or as it is said, there composing various what are called dramas. The contents for these works of theirs are usually various events which are supposed to have occurred or which might occur in the future, or finally, events of their own contemporary unreality. In addition to this, among the symptoms of this peculiar illness, there appear in the common presence of the sick being 7 other very specific particularities. The first is that when this strange illness arises and is already functioning in the presence of a being, particular vibrations are spread around him which act on his environment, as they say, just like the smell of an old goat. The second is that from the change of the inner functioning in such a being, the exterior form of his planetary body undergoes the following changes. His nose is held aloft, his arms, as it is said, akimbo. His speech is punctuated by a special cough, and so on. The third, that such a being always becomes afraid of certain perfectly harmless, natural, or artificial formations, as for instance what are called mice. Hands clenched in a fist, the wife of the chief stage manager of the theater, the pimple on his nose, the left slipper of his own wife, and many other formations outside of himself. The fourth particularity makes him lose entirely all capacity for understanding the psyche of the surrounding beings similar to himself. The fifth, that inwardly and also in his manifestations, he criticizes everybody and everything not connected with him himself. The sixth, that the data for the perception of anything objective are more atrophied in him than in all other terrestrial three-brained beings. And the seventh and last particularity is that there arise in him what are called hemorrhoids, which, by the way, is the sole thing that he carries with modesty. It usually then further happens there that if the sick being has an uncle who is a member of one or other of their parliaments, or if he himself gets acquainted with the widow of a former businessman, or if the period of his preparation for becoming a responsible being has for some reason or other been spent in such an environment or under such conditions that he has automatically acquired the property called slipping in without soap. Then what is called the producer, or as he is also called, the owner of lambs, takes this work of his and orders the mentioned contemporary actors to reproduce it exactly as it was wiseacred by this being who has fallen ill with the strange illness of dramatizing. And these contemporary actors there first reproduce this work themselves alone, without strangers, and they reproduce it until it is exactly as the sick being himself has indicated and as the producer has ordered. And when finally their reproduction proceeds without the participation of their own consciousness and feelings, and these contemporary actors themselves are completely transformed into what are called living automatons, then and then only, with the help of those among them who have not yet become entirely living automatons, for which reason they later acquire the name of stage managers, they do the same thing under their direction, but already now in the presence of other ordinary beings assembled in these contemporary theaters. Thus you can now, from all I have just said, easily conclude that besides many definitely maleficent consequences which I shall soon touch upon more in detail, these theaters cannot, of course, provide anything for that lofty aim which the Babylonian learned beings then had in view when they created for the first time such a form of conscious reproduction of perceptions and of the associative reactions to them of other beings similar to themselves. All the same, it must be admitted that from their theaters and from these contemporary actors of theirs, they obtained, of course accidentally, for the processes of their ordinary being existence, one not bad result. To understand in what this not bad result consists, I have first to explain another particularity which becomes proper to the common presence of beings who arise according to the principle aitoklanos. In accordance with this principle, the forming in the presence of such beings of energy necessary for what is called their waking state depends on the quality of the associations which proceed in their common presence during their complete passivity, or as those favorites of yours say, during sleep, and vice versa. That energy necessary for the productiveness of this said sleep is formed in its turn also from the associative process proceeding in them during this waking state, which is dependent on the quality or intensity of their activity. And this began to apply also to these terrestrial three-brained beings from the time when, as I have already told you, great nature was compelled to substitute for the phoulos nittamnian principle, until then proper to their presences, the principle itoklaunos. Thereupon, there was acquired, and there is up till now, in the process of their existence, such a particularity, that if, as it is said among them, they sleep well, then they will also be awake well, and vice versa. If they are awake badly, then they will also sleep badly. So, my boy, as during recent times they have existed very abnormally, then, in consequence, that established automatic tempo has even become changed, which had previously more or less helped the proper associations to proceed in them, and as a result, they now sleep badly, and when awake, are even worse than before. And why these contemporary theaters of theirs, with their contemporary actors, have become useful for improving the quality of their sleep, was due to the following circumstances. After the need to actualize being part dogdidi in themselves had entirely disappeared from the presences of most of them, and every kind of association of unavoidably perceived shocks began to proceed in the process of their waking state only from several already automatized, what are called series of former imprints, consisting of endlessly repeated what are called impressions experienced long ago. There then began to disappear in them, and still continues to disappear, even the instinctive need to perceive every kind of new shock, vital for three-brained beings, and which issue either from their inner separate spiritualized being parts, or from corresponding perceptions coming from without for conscious associations, for just those being associations upon which depends the intensity in the presences of beings of the transformation of every kind of being energy. During the latter 3 centuries, the process itself of their existence has become such that in the presences of most of them during their daily existence, those being confrontative associations almost no longer arise, which usually proceed in three-brained beings thanks to every kind of new perception, and from which alone can data be crystallized in the common presences of three-brained beings for their own individuality. Well then, when your favorites, existing in such a manner in their daily life, go to these contemporary theaters and follow the senseless manipulations of these contemporary actors, and receive shocks, one after the other, from every kind of reminiscence already previously perceived, of not less senseless and absurd notions, then during this waking state of theirs, they willy-nilly obtain more or less tolerable being associations, so that when they go home and go to bed, they sleep much better than usual. Although indeed these contemporary theaters, with all that proceeds in them, happen to be in this way, but of course only for today, an excellent means for the better sleep of your favorites, nevertheless the objectively evil consequences of these theaters for beings, and particularly for the rising generation, are incalculable. The chief harm for them from these theaters is that they are an additional factor for the complete destruction in them of all possibilities of ever possessing the need proper to the three-brained beings, called the need for real perceptions. They have become such a maleficent factor, chiefly owing to the following. When they go to their theaters and, sitting quietly, look on at every kind of varied, many-sided, even though senseless, manipulations and manifestations of their contemporary actors, then, although they are in their usual waking state, yet every kind of association, both thinking and feeling, proceeds in them exactly as they proceed during their complete passivity or sleep. Namely, when they receive a large number of accidentally corresponding shocks for stimulating the shocks already fixed, and previously perceived and automatized in a series of impressions, and when they reflex these with the functioning of what are called organs of digestion and sex, then, in consequence, obstacles arise in their presences for the proceeding even of those pitiable conscious being associations which have already somehow become automatized to produce in them a more or less correct tempo for the transformation of the substances required for that passive existence of theirs, during which there must be transformed substances required for their active existence. In other words, when they happen to be in these theaters, they are not entirely in that passive state in which the proceeding of the transformation of substances required for their usual waking state has somehow become automatized in them also, with the result that these contemporary theaters of theirs have come to be for them only an additional maleficent factor for the destruction, as I said, of the need for real perceptions. Among many other aspects of the maleficence of this contemporary art of theirs, one of the most obviously ignored, but for all the three-brained beings there, one of the very harmful in respect of the possibility of the acquisition of conscious, what is called individual being, is the radiations of the representatives of contemporary art themselves. Although these maleficent radiations gradually become there the lot or specific attribute of the representatives of all the branches of their art, yet my detailed physiochemical investigation definitely showed me that they are always most maleficent in those mentioned contemporary artists or actors who mime in these contemporary theaters of theirs. The maleficence, for all the other of your favorites, of the totality of the radiations issuing from them, has become distinctly noticeable, particularly in recent times of their present civilization. Although certain of the ordinary beings there long ago used to become such professionals, yet in former times, on the one hand, every kind of data for Hasnamusian properties did not become completely crystallized in the presences of all these professionals, and on the other hand, other of your favorites obviously, instinctively, felt the maleficent influence issuing from these professionals, and hence were on their guard, and behaved towards them in a corresponding manner, and very carefully. Namely, in former centuries, such artists or actors were everywhere relegated by other beings to the lowest caste, and were regarded with contempt. And even at the present time, there, in many communities, for instance on the continent Asia, it is not proper to shake hands with them, as one almost always does when meeting beings similar to oneself. Even up till now, in these said communities, it is also considered defiling to sit with such actors at the same table and to eat together with them. But the contemporary beings of that continent, which at the present time is the chief place of what is called their cultured existence, not only put these contemporary actors on a level with themselves in their inner relations, but even largely imitate their appearance, and at the present time do so pretty thoroughly. The custom of shaving the beard and mustache, now followed by all your favorites, is a very good example for confirming what I have just said. I must tell you that in past epochs, these terrestrial professional actors had always to go with shaved mustaches and beards during the ordinary process of their existence. They had to shave these expressors of masculinity and activity, first of all because always playing the roles of other beings, they had often to change their appearance, and for this they not only had to put on their face a corresponding what is called paint, but also to wear wigs and false mustaches and beards, which they could not possibly do if they had their own beards and mustaches. And secondly, because the ordinary beings of all former communities there, considering such actors dirty and a harmful influence, and fearing to fail to recognize them if they chanced to meet them in ordinary conditions of existence, and of somehow touching them, then promulgated everywhere a severe law that the beings of the profession of artists or actors have always to shave their mustaches and beards in order to be unmistakable for other beings. While explaining just now to you the cause of the arising of the custom of shaving mustaches and beards among actors there, I recall a very sensible what is called measure of justice of the three-brained beings of the epoch of the Tikliametian civilization, connected also with the shaving of the hair, but in this case with the hair growing on the heads of the beings there. A law was then established and strictly enforced that those petty criminals among them who, after trial and sentence by 7 elderly beings of the given district, had been assigned to one of the 4 already previously established categories of immorality and crime, with which beings all of what are called their prisons are now usually crowded, should for a definite term go about always and everywhere with one of the 4 corresponding sides of their heads shaved, and furthermore, any such convicted being was obliged to uncover his head whenever he met or spoke with others. It is interesting to note that there then also existed a law of the same kind about shaving the head in regard to the immoral behavior of women, and namely in regard to women. A sentence existed, and was also very strictly enforced in this instance by 7 elderly local women, who had earned respect by their previous conduct. And the penal measures for women corresponded to the 4 manifestations which were then considered there for women as the greatest laxity and immorality. Namely, if all her neighbors noticed, and all the 7 mentioned elderly women confirmed it, that the given woman had behaved without due regard to and negligently towards her family duties, then, according to the law, she had for a definite term to appear everywhere with painted lips. But if various women noticed that she had begun to manifest toward her children with a weakening of her maternal impulses, then under the same conditions those around her condemned her to go about everywhere, also for a definite term, with the left half of her face made up and painted white and red. And a woman who attempted to violate her chief what is called wifely duty, that is, who deceived or who only tried to deceive her legal husband, or who attempted to destroy a new being conceived in her, was obliged by the same procedure to be always and everywhere, also for a definite term, made up and painted white and red, this time over the whole of her face. At this point of the tales, Beelzebub was interrupted by Ahun with the following words. You are right, Reverence. All your explanations concerning terrestrial art and those three-brained beings there who now practice it and are, so to say, its representatives, and particularly your elucidations concerning the contemporary comedians there, or actors, have suggested to me to use all the impressions fixed in my common presence, which I took in during my last stay on the surface of this planet Earth, which has taken our dear Hasian's fancy, and to give him a good piece of very practical advice. Having said this, Ahun intended to look expectantly at the face of Beelzebub with his usual glance, that is, without blinking for a long time, but as soon as he had noticed his usual, though always sorrowful yet kind and indulgent smile, he, without waiting for the requested permission, and as if confused, at once turned this time to Hasian and spoke as follows. Who knows? Maybe our dear Hasian, you will indeed have to be on that planet Earth and to exist among those peculiar three-brained beings who have taken your fancy. And this time, again keeping the style and intonations of Beelzebub himself, he continued, It is just for this reason that I now wish to initiate you, for any eventuality, into the results of the various impressions which I involuntarily perceived concerning the resulting types, as well as concerning the particularities of their manifestations of those said contemporary representatives of art there. You must know that those beings who are assumed to be the adepts of this contemporary art, which is adorned with a false halo, are not only put on their own level by the other three-brained beings there of the contemporary civilization, particularly during the several latter decades, and imitated by them in their exterior manifestations, but they are always and everywhere undeservingly encouraged and exalted by them, and in these contemporary representatives of art themselves, who really in point of their genuine essence are almost non-entities, there is formed of itself without any of their being consciousness a false assurance that they are not like all the rest, but, as they entitle themselves, of a higher order, with the result that in the common presences of these types, the crystallization of the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer proceeds more intensively than in the presences of all the other three-brained beings there. Just in regard to such unfortunate three-brained beings, the surrounding abnormal conditions of ordinary being existence are already so established that they are bound to be crystallized in their common presences and to become an inseparable part of their general psyche, those of the consequences of the organ Kundabuffer, which they now themselves call swagger, pride, self-love, vanity, self-conceit, self-enamoredness, envy, hate, offensiveness, and so on and so forth. These enumerated consequences are particularly, conspicuously, and strongly crystallized in just those contemporary representatives of art, who are the manipulators of the contemporary theaters there, and they are particularly strongly crystallized in them because, always performing the roles of beings similar to themselves, whose being and significance in the process of their existence are ordinarily far superior to their own, and also, as I have already said, being themselves really almost non-entities, they, with their already wholly automatized reason, gradually acquire false notions about themselves. with such an already quite automatized consciousness and completely nonsensical feelings, they feel themselves to be immeasurably superior to what they really are. I must confess, dear Hassien, that though during our earlier visits to the surface of that planet of yours, and also at the beginning of this last sojourn there, I went about everywhere and had various relations with those three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, I scarcely ever felt in my common presence a genuine impulse of being pity for the infinitely unhappy fate of these favorites of yours, due to circumstances hardly depending on themselves at all. But when, towards the end of that 6th sojourn there, certain of them were formed with a kind of inner presence which is now possessed by all the representatives of almost all the branches of that art of theirs, and when these newly arisen types, taking part in the process of ordinary being existence on the basis of equal rights with the other three-brained beings, there happened to get into the field of the reception of my sight with their already exaggerated, inner, abnormal, what is called being self-appreciation, then they served as a shock for the beginning of the arising in me of the impulse of pity, not only for themselves, but also for all these unfortunate favorites of yours in general. Try now to give your attention not to all the three-brained beings in general, nor to the other representatives of their contemporary art, but just to those who have become and have acquired the title of artists or actors. Every one of them really being in respect of genuine essence, almost what is called a non-entity, that is, something utterly empty, but enveloped in a certain visibility. They have gradually acquired such an opinion of themselves, by means of favorite exclamations, always and everywhere repeated by them themselves, like genius, talent, gift, and still a number of other words, empty also like themselves, that it is as if, among similar beings around them, only they have divine origin, only they are almost God. Now listen and try to transubstantiate for use, at the proper time in the corresponding parts of your common presence, my really very practical advice. This practical advice of mine is that if for some reason or other you should have to exist, particularly in the near future, among the three-brained beings of that planet Earth, which has taken your fancy, I say in the near future because the presences of these three-brained beings who have taken your fancy and all the already fixed exterior conditions of their ordinary being existence frequently degenerate, and if you should have some work or other there proper to every conscious three-brained being, which has as its basis the aim of attaining welfare for surrounding beings, and the fulfillment of which depends partly on them themselves, then in whatever community of the contemporary civilization this may proceed, if you should have to meet in the interests of your work these contemporary terrestrial types in what are called their circles, you must never fail to be very, very careful and take every kind of requisite measures to keep on good terms with them. Why, you must be so careful towards just them, and in order that you may in general better represent to yourself and understand from every aspect these terrestrial, contemporarily arisen types, I must without fail mention 2 further facts which became quite clear there. The first is that, owing as always to the same conditions of ordinary being existence, abnormally established there, and also to the existing illusorily inflated, maleficent idea of their famous art, these representatives of art gradually become crowned, as I've already said, with an imaginary halo in the preconceived picturings and notions of other three-brained beings there, and thereby automatically acquire an undeserved authority, in consequence of which all the rest of your favorites always and in everything assume that any opinion they express is authoritative and beyond dispute. And the second fact is that these contemporary types who have recently arisen there acquire, as they are formed, a corresponding inner presence that permits them to become quite unconsciously on their part just as easily somebody's slave as thanks merely to chance exterior conditions, they can become his worst enemy. That is just why I advise you to be very, very careful not to make enemies among them, so as not to make a lot of trouble for yourself in the actualizing of your affairs. Well then, dear Arsène, the very zimus of my advice to you is that if you should indeed have to exist among the beings of that planet Earth and have dealings with these representatives of contemporary art, then you must first of all know that you must never tell the truth to their face. Let fate spare you this. Any kind of truth makes them extremely indignant, and their animosity towards others almost always begins from such indignation. To such terrestrial types you must always say to their face only such things as may tickle those consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer unfailingly crystallized in them, and which I have already enumerated, namely envy, pride, self-love, vanity, lying, and so on. And the means of tickling which infallibly act on the psyche of these unfortunate favorites of yours are, as I noticed during my stay there, the following. Suppose that the face of one of these representatives of art resembles the face of a crocodile. Then be sure to tell him that he is the image of a bird of paradise. If one of them is as stupid as a cork, say that he has the mind of Pythagoras. If his conduct in some business is obviously super idiotic, tell him that even the great cunning Lucifer could not have thought out anything better. Suppose that on his features you see signs that he has several terrestrial diseases, from which he is progressively rotting day by day. Then with an expression of astonishment on your face, ask him, "Do, please, tell me, what is your secret for always looking so fresh, like peaches and cream?" And so on. Only remember one thing, never tell the truth. Although you have to behave in this manner toward all the beings in general of that planet, it is particularly necessary to do so toward the representatives of all the branches of contemporary art. Having said this, Ahun, with the affectation of a Moscow suburban matchmaker at the marriage of her clients, or of the proprietress of a Parisian fashion workroom in what is called a high-life cafe, began rearranging the folds of his tail. And Hossein, looking at him with his usual sincerely grateful smile, said, "Very many thanks to you, dear Ahun, both for your advice and in general for your elucidation of certain details of the strangeness of the psyche of the three-brained beings of that, in all respects, ill-treated planet of our great universe." And then he turned to Beelzebub himself with the following words, "Please tell me, kind grandfather, is it really possible that nothing has resulted from the intentions and efforts of those Babylonian learned beings, and that indeed nothing whatsoever has passed of those fragments of knowledge which were already then known on the earth to the contemporary three-brained beings of that strange planet?" At this question of his grandson, Beelzebub said as follows, "To the great sorrow of everything existing in the universe, scarcely anything has survived, my boy, from the results of their labors, and hence nothing has become the property of your contemporary favorites. The information they indicated in the said manner passed from generation to generation only in all for a few of their succeeding centuries. Thanks to their chief particularity, namely, to the periodic process of reciprocal destruction, there almost wholly disappeared from amongst the ordinary beings there, soon after the period of the Babylonian magnificence, not only the legal monism concerning the keys to the lawful inexactitudes in the law of sevenfoldness, contained in each of the branches of the being Afalkalno and Solzhinoha, but as I have already told you, there gradually also disappeared even the very notion of the universal law of the holy Hepta Paraparshinok, which in Babylon they then called the law of sevenfoldness. every kind of conscious production of the beings of the Babylonian period was gradually destroyed, partly owing to decay from time and partly owing to the processes of reciprocal destruction. That is to say, to that degree of that psychosis of theirs called the destruction of everything existing within the sphere of the perception of visibility. Thanks chiefly to these two causes, almost all the consciously actualized results of the learned beings of the Babylonian epic gradually disappeared from the surface of that ill-fated planet, and at such a tempo that after 3 of their centuries scarcely any of them were left. It must also be noticed that, thanks to the second mentioned cause, there also gradually diminished and finally almost entirely ceased the employment of that new form, which had been established since Babylonian times, for the transmission of information and various fragments of knowledge to subsequent generations through the beings they called initiates of art. About the disappearance there of just that practice of certain beings becoming initiates of art, I know very well, because just before my departure forever from that planet, I had to elucidate this very carefully for another aim of mine. And for the purpose of making this clear, I even specially prepared a very good ticlunia from among the beings there of the female sex, and made these elucidations of mine through her. Ticlunias were formerly called there pythonesses, but contemporary ones are now called mediums. So then I made it clear that there, in most recent times, only 4 of such beings, initiates of art, still remained, by means of whose what is called immediate line of inheritance, the keys to the understanding of the ancient art still continued to be transmitted. And this transmission, by inheritance, now proceeds there under very complex and arcane conditions. Of these 4 contemporary initiated beings, one comes from amongst those who are called redskins, who dwell on the continent America. Another from among the beings dwelling on what are called the Philippine Islands. The third from the beings of the continent Asia, from the country called the source of the river Pyongyang. And the 4th and last from amongst those who are called Eskimos. Now listen why I use the expression almost when I said that at the end of 3 of their centuries after the Babylonian period, there almost entirely ceased to exist every kind of conscious and automatic reproduction of the being Afukano and Soljinoha. The point is that 2 branches of the conscious hand productions of the beings of the Babylonian period chanced upon favorable conditions, and some of them passed from generation to generation, partly consciously and partly automatically, on the part of the transmitting beings. One of the said 2 branches recently ceased to exist, but the other has even reached certain beings of contemporary times almost unchanged. This branch, which reached beings of contemporary times, is called their sacred dances. And thanks to this branch alone, which survived from the period of the Babylonian learned beings, a very limited number of 3-brained beings there now have the possibility, by means of certain conscious labors, to decipher and learn the information hidden in it and useful for their own being. And the second mentioned branch, which recently ceased to exist, was that branch of the knowledge of the Babylonian learned beings which they called the combination of different tonalities of color, and which the contemporary beings now call painting. The passing of this branch from generation to generation proceeded almost everywhere, but though gradually disappearing also everywhere with the flow of time, it yet proceeded in quite recent times at still quite regular tempo, both consciously and automatically, only among the beings of the community called Persia. And it was only just before my last departure from that planet of yours, when the influence of beings of a similar profession from the contemporary European culture began to become noticeable also there in Persia, and when the beings of that profession in the community Persia began to wiseacre that such a transmission entirely ceased. It must also be noticed that in spite of all this, not a few of the still surviving productions of the Babylonian times reached the beings of the contemporary civilization, chiefly the beings breeding on the continent Europe. But these productions, which reached the beings of this contemporary civilization, and not originals but only half-decayed copies made by their recent ancestors, who had not become entirely what are called plagiarists, they simply, without suspecting the well of wisdom concealed in them, and without taking corresponding practicable measures, stuffed into what are called museums, where these old copies are gradually either totally destroyed or partially mutilated by frequent copyings from them, made by means of various eroding and oxidizing compositions, as for instance alabaster, fish glue, and so on, only so that the copyists might swagger before their friends or cheat their teachers, or achieve some other Hasnamusian aim. It must in fairness be remarked that now and again certain beings also of the contemporary civilization have suspected that something was concealed in the productions which chanced to reach them in the original, specially created then in Babylon by the members of the Club of the Adherents of Legal Monism, or in those copies which were made during their transmission from generation to generation by various conscientious professionals, that is, by such professionals to whom, as I have already said, it was still not quite proper to plagiarize, and who, therefore, did not resort to the detailed remaking of others' productions in order to give them out as their own, and thereafter, while searching very seriously for this something, certain of those inquiring beings of that European civilization even found in them a certain definite something or other. For instance, at the beginning of the contemporary European civilization, one of these beings, a certain monk named Ignatius, who had formerly been an architect, attained even to the possibility of deciphering the hidden knowledge and useful information in the productions of almost all the branches of what was already called ancient art, which had reached him from the Babylonian epoch. But when this monk, Ignatius, was about to share what is called this said discovery of his with other beings there like himself, namely with two of his what are called comrades, monks, together with whom he as a specialist had been sent by his abbot for the purpose of directing the laying of what are called the foundations of a temple, which later became famous, then, for some trifling reason ensuing from the consequences of one of the properties of the organ kundabuffer, crystallized in them, called envy, he was murdered while asleep, and his planetary body was thrown into the water space surrounding that small island on which it was proposed to erect the said temple. The said monk, Ignatius, arose and was formed for the being of a responsible being on the continent of Europe. But when he reached the age of a responsible being, then with the aim of enriching himself with information concerning the profession which he had made the aim of his existence, namely the profession there called architecture, he left for the continent of Africa, and just he it was who entered as a monk into the brotherhood which existed on that continent Africa under the name of the Truth Seekers, and afterwards, when this brotherhood migrated to the continent Europe and increased, and when its brethren began to be called Benedictines, he himself was already an all the rights possessing brother of this said brotherhood. The temple I referred to exists there even up till now, and is called, it seems, Mont Saint-Michel. In this Europe, still several other inquiring beings noticed from time to time lawful inexactitudes in the works of various branches of art which had reached them from ancient times, but no sooner did they find the key to the understanding of these inexactitudes than their existence came to an end. Still, one other, that is, another being from that continent Europe, also noticed them, and continuing to interest himself further and laboring perseveringly, he began fully to decipher the productions of almost all the branches of art. And this wise terrestrial three-brained being was named Leonardo da Vinci. At the conclusion of my present tale about the terrestrial contemporary art, I might as well, I think, remark about yet one other of the many specific particularities of just those beings of the contemporary civilization who are occupied with this famous art. This specific particularity of theirs is that whenever one or other of the mentioned beings, namely of the beings who notice in various productions, which have reached them from ancient times, some very lawful illogicality, and begin to produce the given branch in quite a new manner, perhaps in order to make the said lawful illogicality practically clear to himself, then most of the beings around him, belonging to the profession of the same branch, at once become his followers, and begin doing supposedly the same thing, but of course without either aim or sense. And it is just because of this said specific psyche of the beings there, representatives of contemporary art, that on the one hand, what are called now movements of art are always arising there among your favorites, and on the other hand, that those which are somehow arranged rightly by the preceding generations, even though only after a fashion, are constantly dwindling. Although this proceeds among the representatives of all the branches of contemporary art, yet for some reason or other it is the beings who are occupied in the branch they call painting who are most susceptible to it. Hence it is that at the present time there exists among these contemporary professions a great many new movements of painting which have arisen in this way, and which have nothing in common among themselves. These new movements of painting are known there by the names of Cubism, Futurism, Synthesism, Imagism, Impressionism, Colorism, Formalism, Surrealism, and many other similar movements whose names also end in ism. At this place in Beelzebub's tale, the hooves of all the passengers of the trans-ship Karnak suddenly, as it were, radiated from themselves something phosphorescent. This meant that the ship Karnak was nearing the place of her destination, that is, the planet Revos Redender. Hence, a bustling movement began among the passengers preparing to descend from the ship. Beelzebub, Hassien, and Ahun ended their conversation and hurriedly began to prepare themselves also. The phosphorescent gleaming of the hooves was obtained because, concentrated in a particular proportion, there were directed from the engine room to that part of the ship the holy parts of the sacred, omnipresent Okadaunok.